In February 2020, the Brooks Institute hosted approximately 80 of the most influential actors in the animal protection community to discuss the current state of the animal protection movement. Some of these Congress delegates volunteered to respond to big questions. Here are the responses to the question, what will have the greatest impact for animal protection?
Well, I would say that we need to level the playing field. The interests on the one side of the equation are the industries that profit and make billions and billions of dollars from using animals. And they're able to reinvest a large portion of those profits into lobbying for laws that minimize the interests of animals and marginalize those of us who want to seek greater protections. And on the other side of the equation, you've got passionate, well-meaning animal advocates like those here this weekend and like those working around the world to effect change who are operating with such a disparity of resources. So, there's no large industries that are funding that movement. It tends to be driven by compassionate individuals who donate and leave bequests and legacies behind to make sure that those things can happen. So the power disparity right now, I think, is something that needs to be overcome if we're ever going to get meaningful laws and policies enacted, or at least at a bare minimum to enact our existing societal standards into law.
I think it's also very important to think about the lobbying that Camille's referring to and how to tame or curb or try to control it to some extent, because it is such a corrupting influence, really. And we have a great example in Canada with our most recent food guide where we have got a very health-friendly, animal-friendly, environment-friendly food guide because the political process was restricted to evidence-based online submissions that did not allow for special meetings or special lobbying from industry. And we think that that's a very promising example of how you can level the playing field in this way that is so necessary because of disparity of resources and also because of societal consensus kind of not really quite being there yet, right? That's something like the food guide, that's what it's really meant to do, is lead people and help people see, okay, this is a healthier option, this is a more animal-friendly option. That's really important, and it's really hard to get there when you've got those disparities.
I think the greatest impact is going to come from a change of awareness. I know that education and information is by no means a sufficient basis for change, but it is necessary. Interestingly enough, I suspect the solution may come from a completely different place. It may come from technology, cell-based meat, it could come from environmental concerns. I think all those will roll in together, and there'll come a point, I think it was J.S. Mill said that one of the problems with thinking about the beliefs of our predecessors, our parents, our grandparents, is not that they held those beliefs, but the greatest problem for us is imagining how they could possibly have believed those things. So, yeah, I think huge transformation is quite possible.
I think what will have the greatest impact for animal protection change is to kind of concentrate our efforts less on changing the views of adults, which are already really formed, especially around animal agriculture and aquaculture, because so much of what we eat relates to ideas of family, relates to culture, relates to childhood, and one's sense of belonging in the world. So I really feel strongly that the greatest impact would be to reach human beings in their childhood years before these ideas take hold. And so to be kind of integrating a pathway in a systematic way in early childhood through elementary years, middle school, before children kind of get really entrenched in views, to say, this is a new vision of the world. This is not acceptable, and here's why. And we really, I think, have an untapped resource in kids. We don't pay them a lot of attention in society in general, and we don't treat them with respect and that they can hold views and take them forward. If we change that mindset, it relates to how we look at animals actually for many people. They're both kind of othered in this way. I really do think that there's a chance for transformative potential in 15 to 20 years.
So globally right now, there are 80 billion farmed animals that are raised and slaughtered every year. And they're kept in horrible conditions. They're crammed in cages and crates and warehouses, never to see the light of day till they go off to their horrible slaughter. And that's not just a problem for those farmed animals. It's a huge problem for our planet as well. So we have 1/3 of our arable land is right now being used to feed farmed animals that are kept in these conditions instead of ourselves directly. And not only that, when you look at all the greenhouse gas emissions that are coming from animal agriculture, it makes up more than all of the planes, trains, and automobiles put together. And we have all this ecologically important habitat that's being cut down just to feed and house these farmed animals. And in my lifetime, the number of birds, amphibians, mammals, and reptiles has been cut in half because of this destruction of the environment. And it's largely to do with our consumption patterns around meat, dairy, and eggs. And the worst part of that is with human population growth set to go to 10 billion by 2050, the United Nations is predicting that we'll go from 80 billion farmed animals to about 140, so almost double. And so the impact is mind-boggling. It's totally mind-boggling. And so at the same time, so we should have this like feeling of this is an urgent problem. It should be, alarm bells should be going off. But right now, and this is only one measure, but it is a pretty good measure, is philanthropic dollars going to this cause. Well, there is $427 billion going to philanthropic work in the United States. Of that, only 3% is going to environment where animals are within that. Animals make up a fraction of that 3%, and farmed animals make up less than 1% of that. So while this should be alarm bells, everyone should be stopping what they're doing and focusing on this. We don't have that sense of urgency, and we really need to have a sense of urgency because it really is an existential crisis for not just our planet, but for our species.
When it comes to questions of what might have the greatest impact for animal protection change, as you know and see that I work for 3 different organizations, for me there are many different ways to make change. I think if I had one commonality that I most passionately believe in, it's about stories and narratives that allow us to change. And different factors in society and different individuals in society will require different stories in order to allow them to change. So while I think cultivated meat and plant-based meat offers an opportunity to destabilize the market, for me what's most interesting is how farmers and ranchers and fishermen and others will see themselves as stewards of the environment and protectors of the natural world and transition, but retain their identities and their self-notions of what it is that they are doing and how they have value in the world in such a way that the resistance to that change will be less before the change that is forced upon them by the climate crisis occurs. So we need to create stories that allow people to change and become something different while retaining the individual sense of who it is that they are and how they bring value and worth to the world. So that is, I think, the fundamental thing. It's not the one thing, it's the stories that we can create and tell ourselves about how to transition our economy away from something that is simply not going to be able to exist in its current form within the next 10 to 15 years.
I think what will have the greatest impact for changing things for animals is if we can change the default in the way we eat. I see this as kind of an interesting mean between pushing towards an all kind of vegan future, which might be really desirable for many of us, but is very countercultural, and just asking for less meat or better meat. What we've kind of found is the idea that we could switch our default from the standard American diet to something that is primarily plant-based is a place people are ready to go now, knowing that when they need to or they want to, they have the choice to do other things. But if we can change what's considered the normal meal, get that to be plant-based. So when I order a burger, unless I specify, it's a plant-based burger. This strikes me as the sort of change we can affect in institutions at a very large scale. The other thing about changing the defaults, in addition to it having this kind of perfect mean between not pushing too hard and not pushing enough, is that it's both material and kind of has to do with ideas. When you change the default at a large institution, you are changing things very significantly in terms of numbers of animals used. But you're also inviting people to think about things differently. Whereas if I just say less meat, even if we go along with it, it's not necessarily changing the ideas about what it means to have a meal. But if we can change the default, we really can affect a social transformation. Changing the default around food also is a great place to do coalitional work. So by changing the default of what we eat to be more plant-based, we're automatically in alliance with folks who are working on climate change. With CARE, we can really be in alliance with people working on anti-racism and social justice efforts. We can really push towards a new way of eating, which is more just generally, which is a vision I think that can really inspire people. It's a vision that goes a lot further than just less meat, but it's still a realizable vision.
As an attorney, my reason for getting into the animal movement, the animal rights, animal protection movement 40 years ago, was to bring lawyers to the table for animals. I felt that lawyers who are in a position of power in our society should be at this table representing the interests of animals. And that's what I've devoted my career to, is creating a movement that is now called Animal Law and building an agency that could do that work. I'm the founder of the Animal Legal Defense Fund, and I worked for 40 years to create a playing field where people would come to. Today, we have a movement in which there are thousands of attorneys who are devoting some time, whether it be pro bono time on the side of their jobs or full-time working for agencies such as mine, Center for Animal Law Studies, Humane Society of the US, or some other agency. And these lawyers have been able to bring cases that have changed the way that animals are treated. They've been able to work for laws that create greater protections. It's one part of the movement. It's not the whole movement, but it's a significant part of the animal protection, animal rights movement.
You know, in my experience, one of the things that I think is most important to have an impact is engagement. And it's engagement with opponents and engagement with as broad and diverse a group of people we can bring into the movement. When I was in some science conferences, I remember realizing that the bioengineering field is a great example of this, because that's where a lot of the real growth in science came from, by bringing together the biology and the engineering fields. And we've seen some of the great microphysiological systems and organ-on-a-chip systems come out of that biologically inspired engineering. So I think that cross-disciplinary engagement is really key to moving things forward.
I think that no particular thing is going to by itself have the greatest impact for animal protection change. I think that in order to make the change that we want to see, we need a broad pluralistic movement that involves lots of people taking different and seemingly conflicting approaches. We need moderate advocacy, we need radical activism, we need people pursuing social change, institutional change, political change, and technological change all at the same time. And people working on those issues from within academia, from advocacy, from a policy perspective. And if we can build that kind of pluralistic movement with that many different actors doing all of those different types of things, then those activities will work together in order to help us make progress on these issues. But none of those things in isolation is going to have the same kind of impact.
Because I work at a sanctuary, I see every day the impact when a human actually gets to meet one of these beings that we call a farmed animal and gets to know them as an individual. So at Woodstock Sanctuary, we have about 10,000 visitors a year. So that means that that's 10,000 people actually meeting a turkey for the first time ever, or meeting a pig outside of a petting zoo or some terrible environment. And the change that happens and the powerful transformative impact that those relationships can have on the humans and the animals is really incredible. And I think when people can actually meet a 900-pound pig who would have been killed at 6 months and is now 10 years old and living out her golden years at a sanctuary, and actually get to know her as an individual because, you know, she's weird and funny and stubborn and just like your dog, that they can never look at pigs or bacon or pork the same way again. And I think that has the power to transform the whole world, because animal agriculture is one of the reasons that this planet is heading towards catastrophic climate change. And I think, ironically, those that are being victimized also have the power to turn this around and save us. All we have to do is give them a platform. So I truly believe that like centering the animals and refocusing on them and telling their stories and actually getting people in a space where they can meet them in person or virtually is the most important thing we can be doing right now. And honestly, like, I'm so lucky to be able to know sheep and I'm so lucky to be able to like actually know cows and call cows my friends, because it's a truly magical thing to be able to know these beings. And there's no way that I could ever exploit them or look at them as anything else than individuals at this point. And I believe that would be true of most people.
You know, it really is interesting because when Tim Medora was calling the Congress to order, he was talking about Brooks McCormick Jr. and his love for dogs and pets. And that's why I got into animal law. You know, when I was little, I would run the fields with my dog Booty, and he went everywhere with me. And and that instilled an interest in me for all animals. And I think that focusing on pets, keeping pets in their family, stopping the killing of dogs and cats in animal shelters throughout the United States is something that we need to strive for. And actually, I think dogs and cats can be a gateway to other, to empathy for farm animals, for wildlife. I think that it is the personal relationship that you have with an animal that opens a gateway for you to really understand how important these creatures are.
I think there are a number of things we can do to have a really great impact on animal protection change, and a lot of people are already working on wonderful things. I think one of the things that we can do is expand our horizons, and we have been doing that, all of us, I think, in different ways, and people have tended sometimes to work in silos in really specific areas, and that's great because they can work really deeply in a very specific area. But I think working more broadly and bringing in more voices, and by that I mean a lot of different kinds of things. So I mean more kinds of people to bring in more perspectives, more experiences, so that we can understand how to communicate with people who want to advocate for animals. I also mean people who are engaged in working with animals in ways that people don't like. So ranchers, farmers, researchers, we need to be talking with them so that we're not just dismissing them, disrespecting them. We need to bring them into the conversation and help them understand our perspectives, understand their perspectives, and see where we can meet to do what everyone wants to do. We want good research, we want good food, right? And so if we can do that without harming animals, and I think there's a lot of ways that we can do that, we need to be able to have those conversations in a respectful way. So we need to bring those folks into the conversation and not just be opposing them or speaking out against them all the time. And then I also think we need to be thinking more broadly about the kinds of animals that we're working with and for. And so that's part of the reason we started the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative, because they were a group of animals that people don't really see. Literally, you don't see them, and it's hard to then understand what their needs are, understand where the gaps in protection, legal and social policy protection are for them. So we want to raise them up to the visible level so that we can have conscious and constructive conversations about what their needs are and how that can be harmonized with the environmental needs and human needs in other capacities. And then using that just as an example of other animals. We don't tend to talk about insects or reptiles, and so trying to figure out how we can broaden the tent, if you will. I think that's what will help us move forward the best.
I think the greatest impact on animal protection change is twofold. First, it's being able to facilitate, to embrace and facilitate diversity. We need diversity in our, and by having diversity, then we'll have better reporting, we'll have better research. We need to do it in our language, we need to do it in our programming, so that we have a multi-dimensional approach. And I think if we can do that, then we'll have a large impact. But in order to do that, we have to do what Dale Jamieson said earlier in the program about owning the language. And we really need to be able to get to the person on the street, as it were, to the general public or the majority. And we do so by incorporating all kinds of diverse language, but also by having truly language that reflects our values of the movement. The other part about language is the reason why we need to think about language and have a language that reflects those values is that language reflects habit, not thought. We need to work up and develop for the general public the habit of using the language of animal protection.
I think
And I mentioned this today earlier that I've worked in both the environmental and animal protection movements, and I think we need to get out of our silos, and we really need to look at how we can bridge between movements. And we need to see what are the overlaps between social justice movements that include animal protection, environmental conservation, indigenous rights. I'm a real believer that there's a lot of common ground to be had that we haven't yet really sought and worked to find that common ground and see where we can work together. I think we're much stronger when we work together. We're at a time where there's something called nature deficit disorder, where kids are basically disconnected from wild nature. And I think that's very dangerous for the planet, especially at a time when we are truly suffering from climate change. And if we have a young populace that has been disconnected and doesn't know what it's like to be out in nature, hasn't connected with a wild animal, whether that's a bird or a coyote, I think that's very dangerous, because we don't work to take care of what we don't know and what we don't love. So I think reaching youth and educators is absolutely critical, and that's part of what we try to do with Project Coyote.
So much is happening today in animal protection and animal rights, and I think the challenges are huge, and they're interdisciplinary and they're overlapping. So what we need are well-trained advocates who can jump into a variety of different areas. So I'm in academia, and so my focus tends to be how can we train more advocates effectively to go out there and change the world for animals. So I think the biggest change that we can make for animals is to make sure that we have a lot of people educated and trained and ready to hit the ground running to do things for animals in a variety of different disciplines.
So my viewpoint on the relationship between factory farming and climate change is that in order to address climate change, we need to be talking about factory farming and the devastating impact it has on the environment. So the United Nations, it's saying that 14.5 of the methane produced is coming from factory farms. We know that it's polluting the water. We know that it's polluting the soil. So it really has a devastating effect. And I think that there's room to be hopeful, because what we're seeing through award season is that a lot of these awards shows decided to opt for a plant-based diet. And we even had Joaquin Phoenix in the Oscars, who's a vegan, talking about the relation between climate change and veganism. So I think it's really important that we have this discussion about climate change. And if we see activists like Greta Thunberg, she's a vegan, and she's a vegan for a reason. She's a vegan because she understands the devastating effects of animal agriculture. So that, I think, is really important. It's a discussion that we can bring as an animal protection movement, and I think that it's something that we really need to focus on.
What will have the greatest impact for animal protection is when, A, we human beings stop acting as if we are the only ones who matter, and who then, B, understand that the greatest impact we can have in terms of number is to stop eating animals who want their lives as much as we do, who experience every emotion we do, who experience pain and suffering, and who are as individual as we are.
Well, it's hard to say what the greatest impact will be, but I do think that fundamental to the success long-term of the animal protection movement is we have to change our laws. You know, our laws are sort of a codification of our values as a society. And as long as we have our laws saying that animals are essentially things without interests or rights that should be represented and protected in law, I think we're fighting a losing battle. So I think to have the greatest impact, the animal protection movement really has to fundamentally change the way our law views and treats animals. So right now, our laws essentially tell us that animals are things, more like a couch or the chair I'm sitting on, than living sentient beings who really have the same capacity to feel pain and fear and joy that we have. So I think it's essential that we reform our laws so that they recognize that animals are indeed feeling sentient beings. And until we reach that point, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to say we've succeeded in our broader mission.
So over the course of the summit that we've had here,
one of the fundamental questions has been the narratives that shape our understanding of the relationship between humans and other animals. And in my work with Christians, I'm really aware that religious narratives about how we understand animals are really fundamental to how we think about the ethics of what we're doing in relation to other animals. But the animals movement has been neglecting of that, insofar as the animals movement has been aware of the need to engage in with religious people about animals issues. It's largely been unable to have a sense of what it means to engage with religious people in their own language. And so the organization I set up 4 years ago called Creature Kind is really trying to engage Christians with faith-based reasons for concern for other animals. And I think that's a major challenge and opportunity for the movement, to engage for the first time with religious constituencies about why they might have faith-based reasons for being concerned about animals and rethinking their practice.
Well, I think we're in a moment of cultural opportunity. I think right now we are seeing that we truly have the potential to make vegan a mainstream concept, to actually move the cultural needle in that direction. And what I mean by that is not just sort of behavior change around eating habits being changed. It also includes kind of a raising of a cultural literacy around this topic. And I think we can see with the recent uptick in the interest of it and the convergence of a number of different reasons for people coming to the issue that we have that opportunity. And I think being able to understand what motivates the mainstream and how to do this will actually be the thing that across the board helps all animals. There's something that we always hear about the numbers and the acute nature of the suffering that's coming to the farm animals, which is a strong argument. But I think you can take this another step, which is, well, we are still eating animals, not necessarily you and I, but as a culture, while it remains accepting of sort of a cultural norm, we cannot really move the needle for animals in a meaningful way. It's about sort of internalizing those ethics and bringing the sort of right and wrong, sense of right and wrong to the mainstream, and stopping eating animals as a vehicle to do that.
I am looking at the notion of animal suffering as an environmental harm, because as I mentioned earlier, animals are part of the environment. I have yet to meet anyone who doesn't acknowledge that animals are part of the environment. And we have laws, including the National Environmental Protection Act, which says that, for example, federal agencies have to disclose any potential harms to the environment from agency actions. So if we say that animals are part of the environment and suffering is harm, two things that are virtually undeniable, then animal suffering must be an environmental harm. And therefore, it should have to be disclosed in an environmental impact statement. So if we think about that for a moment, you think, oh my God, now industrial agriculture operators, CAFO operators, will have to say exactly how many hundreds of thousands of chickens they're going to torture and kill every year. And also the law requires them to discuss alternatives to it. And so once that information, this is solely an informational thing. They just have to put it out there. When more people know, if one trusts that most people are actually not interested in harming other beings gratuitously, which again is my experience, then we have an opportunity to actually give people information that can change their way of thinking about how they live in the world with animals. And the same thing goes for wild animals, because if we have, for example, a predator cull, well, those animals suffer. They suffer when you trap them, they suffer when you poison them. So rather than talk about, the effects on the ecosystem, which everybody already does and is extremely important, let's talk about the actual agony that these animals endure as an environmental harm.
So I think for, the greatest impact for animal protection change is a too big question for myself, so I have to focus on what my contribution can be. And I'm a big believer in sort of understanding what you as an individual can do and what your strengths are, and then bringing those strengths forward to the world and trying to make the world a better place. So for me, I have sort of a scientific bent to the way I think about the world. And so one of the things that I'm really interested in is how science can be used to be a positive influence rather than being a negative influence. And I think that one of the things that I've noticed across my career is that the hidden values that are built into science are part of what is stopping science from doing good work, in particular science with animals. You know, the values that are embedded in science that I think are particularly destructive are human supremacy, that the science that we do with animals is always with respect to ourselves and with respect to the idea that we are somehow better than animals. And individualism, much more focused on how individuals are extracted from the world, extracted from their social networks, and sort of accepting and a promoting of using animals, exploiting them, putting them into systems to serve us, and understanding them within those systems rather than on their own terms. So I think that one of the things that we need to do in the movement is to use science that has rejected all of those values and instead sort of embraced, a horizontal, embedded, networked systems way of seeing the world where empathy plays a big role, personal connections play a big role, personal relationships play a big role, and sort of embrace and rediscover, our relationship with animals, with nature, and have that play a central role in the science that we're doing to reflect back where we need to be, which is, again, I think, to get to the place of, loving animals, loving the planet, loving our place in the world, and that this can be something to be celebrated rather than something to be questioned or rejected or denied.
I think the biggest impact for animal protection change is going to be in rights-based legislation. The reason I say that is because I think that there is a very deep-seated reason why we treat other animals the way we do. And I'm not sure that that's tractable. We're still living under a scala natura viewpoint of nature where humans are on top and are qualitatively different than the other animals. And I think that's where we're going to keep all the other animals because it's convenient for us. And so my view is the way forward is to put in place protections, animal regulations, legislation, rights-based policies that actually protect the other animals from us.
When I first learned about what was happening to animals, I knew that I wanted to get involved and do something, and I had no idea what to do. And I think we as a movement put a lot of information out there and do inspire people to think, oh, I want to do something. But aside from go vegan or don't go to the circus or boycott, products tested on animals, I don't think that we as a movement really provide a lot of support for people to get more involved. There are so many barriers to entry to becoming an activist in some way. And that's really why I started Yay Camp, is I really see Yay Camp as kind of an intervention for someone who knows that they want to do something, but they don't know what, they don't know how, they don't know really where to begin. And when you're in that kind of space, it's very tempting and easy to just kind of default to our societal narrative of I'm just one person, I'm busy, I have a job, I don't have that much money to just donate, and I'm just one person, what can I really do? It's just such an easy default, and there's so many challenges to becoming an activist, from just psychologically of taking a position on something, opening yourself up to criticism, dealing with the heartbreak of really putting your whole effort into something that's going to be really hard. And so I think, one of the key things that we do at Yay Camp is train people in the full gamut of resources that they need to get active on a cause that they care about. So our whole curriculum is based on building knowledge, skills, confidence, and community. I think as a movement, we focus on knowledge. And because we have Facebook, or Meetup or whatever, we kind of have the community, and events like this certainly build community, but we don't do very much on skills, and we certainly don't do much on confidence. Getting active on a cause that you care about almost be a non-starter if you don't really see a path for how can you get involved, like what does that look like? And especially with changes within a lot of the movement's strategy has changed in recent years, so that for years it was like leafleting, like go out and leaflet. And the movement has shifted away from that. So it's like, that's not the main thing that we're pushing for. And I'm not really sure organizationally what the main volunteer push that animal groups are pushing for at this point, you know, like tweet at this company or, you know, I think it's hard for people to locate themselves and like, how do I get involved? I can donate, I can, you know, post something on social media, I can boycott this product. But I think we have a lot of people who would do more if we mobilized them better and if we provided support and resources to help them get involved in whatever ways would inspire them.
I think one of the most important ways that we can stop animals from suffering and from being exploited is to change how we relate to them in the food system. And specifically as people shift from eating animals and start eating more plants and plant-based foods, I think we can save many, many billions of animals over time. So I think animal protection is a people issue, and what we eat has profound impacts on other animals.
Collaboration, I think, will have the greatest impact. We can't just all work in our own little universes and not bring these ideas together. And so folks working in these different areas have to share ideas and share information with each other. That has been made very apparent this weekend, that we have to share ideas. I've learned so much. People have told me that they've learned so much from me. And so in order for us to gain momentum and move things forward, we have to share with each other.
So I think that looking at issues of enforcement holds a lot of promise for changing the world for animals. We're in a really pivotal moment for our relationship with non-human animals right now. Public concern and public opinion is really swaying in favor of animals and in favor of treating them better than we do. And that's despite huge resources being spent by industries that exploit them. And we're starting to see that translate into our laws. Some recent examples include bans on the most intensive confinement of animals, bans on the retail sales of pets, and bans on the use of wild animals for entertainment. But we can have the best laws in the world, and if they don't have really good enforcement mechanisms, they're not really worth the paper that they're written on. And I've been in the animal advocacy movement for a quarter century. I've been an animal law professor and practitioner for more than a decade, and what I've seen over and over and over again is that you have laws that are supposed to protect animals and seem to provide meaningful protections, but they don't have meaningful enforcement mechanisms. So I think we really need to be focusing attention on that.